I think it's worth exploring some of your background, because I think it's quite interesting, and like just like your intellectual journey, because I would still have no idea how to describe what you do, but it's very interesting.
I mean, we all do many things, right? We have to separate these. There are ways in which I pay the bills, right?
Yeah.
And I'm increasingly over time attempting to align the way in which I pay the bills with my other interests in research. That said, for quite some time after I graduated college, I decided, instead of pursuing more academic research, to go into sort of the emerging field of software application development, and applied a lot of my intellectual background to that for some time. And I guess the place people will be most familiar with was I worked with Netflix for a while. Before that, I worked with some other companies that people might know. But yeah, I mean, that was a very interesting period of development, because I felt that the way in which people were beginning to increasingly interact with applications, software applications, along every dimension of their life and along every dimension of their values, opened up a lot of opportunities for me to try to apply the knowledge I had gained in my previous education around evolutionary psychology, and trying to understand how these new technological media were interacting with and providing certain new types of feedback to our brains, both the parts of our brains that are more plastic and adaptive and novel, and the parts of our brains that are much deeper and have a lot more inertia behind them. And the way that this is all interacting, both in the individual, but then as it interacts with individuals, and those individuals interact with one another, a whole other pattern begins to emerge in terms of a new mode of connection and all that. So yeah, I mean, that was my original professional reality. I've been doing a lot more research lately along the sort of mathematical and complexity science aspect of things, trying to understand emergent systems and understand what it means to try to design emergent systems. That's something we could talk about. Could also, if you want to go even back further in my history, I have like a whole educational trajectory, but I think actually a lot of perhaps upon reflection, the more I've thought about my life path, the more I do think or feel that some unique aspects of my sort of childhood trajectory had a pretty deep impact on the way I see the world, and perhaps that's unique as well. So wherever you want to go, it's fine.
Yeah. So I think there's two broad areas that I'd like to cover in our discussion. One is something that I don't think gets enough attention, and that's just Jordan Peterson and his main body of work, like the stuff that he's like dedicated his life to. I think he tends to get a lot of people tend to focus on like him placed in contemporary social contexts and his interpretations of them, and they focus on his view of the problems that we're facing today, but they just kind of completely discount maps of meaning and everything that he dives into there. So I'd like to I watched your interview with Jordan. It was very good. I think it was one of my favorites. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, because I think what that does is it'll lead into discussions of creating this new emergent global society in the, or attempting to create a global society that works and that ensures the survivability of not only our species, but all of life. So I think I want to start with the Jordan Peterson stuff, because I think there's like a kernel of what could be seen as the underlying morality or ethics that will actually guide the development of these systems. Because I think he's actually onto something that is grounded in the material world, right? We use this metaphysical religious language to describe these things. And there's been this not an easy way to bring together our understanding of the material world and, ethics. But I think through like what complexity science is doing and what Jordan Peterson has done is kind of bridge these things. And so I'd like to explore that, and then how that may translate into building a better world, and then your thoughts on what we need to consider there, because I think that you're a very what's the word? It's a bit early, so it's escaping me. But I think that you're in a way a social critic, or just I think you've got a very, very unique perspective, and one that needs to be shared more widely. And I think perhaps one of the reasons why you're not, why you don't have 100,000 followers is just because you use such precise language, which is necessary, but it's impenetrable to many unless they've done like a lot of the reading. Like, I'll read something that you've written, and I'll have to go and look up. I'll have to go and do a whole set of research to really make sense of it. And I know you've said that you do that on purpose, and I appreciate it. And it's been a wonderful journey over the past couple of years. Kind of coming on this intellectual journey with you in a way.
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you. I mean, it means a lot to me that some element of that desire for, I guess, a kind of, I don't want to use the word purity. I think it's more of a certain, so I was asked in another conversation I had recently about, what makes a heuristic either useful or potentially damaging. And I think the tack I took on that is an idea around how information gets compressed, right? So how you actually take a very complex picture and how you compress that image of reality down to something that can be easily held in one's head and applied in the moment that it is necessary or useful, right? And then the question then becomes, well, if it is then possible to do that with differing degrees of success, right? And it can look different when you compress information down to something that is a lot more terse, a lot fewer words. And so, as you noted on Twitter, one of the things that, I don't really want, in some ways, I don't really want a lot of notoriety. I don't want a lot of recognition. I would like to have the right conversations with the right people that can help perhaps catalyze patterns of social progress and development that are sort of metastable, as opposed to getting involved in a lot more of the, and this is kind of a segue into Jordan Peterson, because I wanted to lay a little bit of that framework, because I think what happens when most people come across his content, if you look at any person as think of them like any other object with like multiple facets. So think of it like a multiple-sided die that you might roll. And on any roll, you might have a particular side of that multifaceted die that lands face up. And the way that a lot of our current communications technologies work is that, it's very easy for a very complex person to be presented only through the lens of that one face that happens to be up at this one time for some set of circumstances, some circumstantial reason. And with Jordan Peterson, that was because he took a very firm stand on a particular issue that had a lot of complexity and reasoning behind it. But then he was obviously thrust into the limelight within that context, and that had upsides and downsides. The upside was that he was able to share a lot more of the other kinds of thinking that he does, which we can get into in a moment, which I think is a highly synthetic kind of thinking that is both absolutely necessary to the next generation of social evolution and social structures, emergent structures. And it also has a lot.
Sorry to interject, but what do you mean by synthetic? Do you mean like synthesis, or that which is not like organic?
Well, so I think what I do mean is synthetic in terms of synthesis, right? The more original meaning of the word. We've come to use the label synthetic to mean man-made because of the fact that we've associated the ability to bring pieces together into some sort of novel and recognizable technology with the capacity of the human to create things, right? So we create this distinction between organic and synthetic that is not actually as real as one might imagine. But also what I'm really getting at is that the synthetic mind, or the synthetic mode of thinking, is that which can reach across traditional boundaries of specialization. And because we're sort of in a late stage phase of a world in which the vast majority of our interaction with knowledge and information and professionalization has been hyper specialized, the synthetic thinker in the early 21st century often shows up as someone who is stepping on a lot of toes. And there are a lot of people who will reactively respond to anyone who attempts to cross those boundaries. And also it's hard to parse whether someone is of high quality or not, right? Because if there's no if there's no one who's an expert in the same 10 fields, then who's supposed to be able to verify or validate that the person who's talking about issues that cross those 10 fields is speaking about something interesting and not nonsensical, right? So we're grappling with all of these challenges, but we're in this place where this kind of transdisciplinary synthetic thinking has never been more needed, but we're also in a position where it's never been more difficult to accept, especially for some people who have made entire careers and risen to the top of their specialized fields. So I think, Jordan Peterson got it from both sides, where he got it from people who were, first of all, really upset with the political stance he took, or the way that they perceived his political stance through that one political facet of his identity. But then also, he got it in many other ways from people who perhaps also disagree with him politically, but felt that he was treading on their turf intellectually, right? And they didn't see the content in their fields. Like, for example, when he's talking about religious studies, or if he's talking about, let's say he's talking about something like a power law distribution of different phenomenon in social reality, and he's connecting something like a power law distribution to the way that social or creatures organize themselves with respect to hierarchical organization. Well, it might be the person that's used to using statistics to understand power law phenomenon doesn't really connect the phenomenon of a power law with the biological dynamics that give rise to hierarchical relations, right? But because he's looking at two fields, and because he's trying to create a narrative and story and communicate that to the public, he's going to aggravate certain people who don't see those connections. So I don't know, but by the same token, that's exactly the kind of sense making that we need in the world today.
And there's also loss that occurs when you're trying to bring together such disparate, complex, fields that have centuries or decades of research and work behind them. When you try to combine them and then communicate how that synthesis comes together, those who are really well versed in specific aspects of it will actually recognize potential issues. And this reminds me, I started writing a piece a while ago on basically the importance of drafts. What I mean by draft is like a first go at something, and how that Jordan Peterson is a great example of someone who has brought together a variety of different fields and insights, and has combined them in a way that really touches on something fundamentally true or something that's very important. However, it's not a completely accurate representation of what's going on, or I might say it as he's not right 100% of the time, because like when you're combining all these different things, you may misrepresent something, or you may slightly misunderstand something. So your representation may not be 100% correct, but it's correct enough for other people to build upon. And I think when people come across his work, sometimes they may see him express something in a way that actually isn't quite right. They discount a lot of the other stuff that he has to say, but I think it's like, if you think about it in like the 0 to 1 Peter Thiel perspective, when you're creating something new, like going from the horse and carriage to the car, the first car wasn't very good, but it could be iterated upon and made that much better, and even made better than the best horse and carriage, but it might have been that way initially. So I guess my point is like, I think he gets a lot of his insights they get discounted because they're a draft in a way, and he's one man. There's only so much one person can do when it comes to assimilating all of the information out there and trying to piece it together.
Yeah, I mean, these ideas people have been recognizing patterns like this in the way that individuals make sense within or across fields for some time. I think the mathematician Freeman Dyson, he categorized mathematicians as either birds or frogs, right? The bird types are those that would fly across many fields and try to make observations from an elevation that allows for a particular expansive viewpoint, but that doesn't include the detail of the picture that the frogs on the ground, in the thick of it, in the mud, right, inside all of the small details, they live inside those details. They live at ground level, right? And so, and you have this tension between these two perspectives, and it's not necessarily that either of them is, this is this interesting question of accuracy, right? It's not as if, I think it's actually very difficult for somebody to make the case that there's an inherent accuracy of a particular characterization that transcends all perspectives, right? So it's like, for example, the accuracy of a description of a molecule from the perspective of a physicist versus the perspective of a chemist versus the perspective of a biologist, right? In terms of the relevance of that particular molecule to processes on different levels of complexity or different orders of complexity in relation to different structures of different magnitudes, right? Or you could humanize this more and say something along the lines of, like, let's say that you have a girlfriend or a fiance or a wife, and you have a particular kind of relationship, and you two have a particular viewpoint on your relationship in terms of how it feels to be in it. But then your friends or your society or the other people around you who observe you two together, they have their own perspective on your dynamics from the outside in, so to speak. And is one of those more accurate than the other, or are they simply describing the way that that same phenomena relates to other phenomena of different types in different ways, right? And I think that the latter way of looking at that is a more accurate way of, is a higher fidelity representation of reality. That being said, it's much more difficult to try to hold all of that in our heads, because at the end of the day, we have to act in the moment. We have to simplify things to a kind of logic that works from moment to moment in terms of a life well lived, not just a life most accurately represented. So, these are these issues that we're confronting. And I think, the issues when someone like Peterson attempts to synthesize across many fields, by definition will mean that the resolution within each field has to suffer some, has to become slightly more coarse. But what that does not mean, or what that should not mean, is that you then go and ask a specialist to discount the entire picture because the view from the bird does not match the view from the frog, right? It's an entirely different way of thinking about things. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say, or how I would think about that.
Yeah, I really like the bird and the frog metaphor. That maps onto the way I see these things as well. And
I think that was Freeman Dyson, but fact check me on that. So
I have a habit of saying, I think this is what this person said, but I could be completely wrong. So please, go into your own research, because I make those mistakes all the time. This makes me think of the pursuit, like the project of science, and how our scientific theories are never completely accurate, right? But they are good enough to deal with the set of problems in the space that they're working in, and that science is we're constantly moving forwards and developing new frameworks that enable us to deal with the questions the questions that we have in that local space. But after a while, we exhaust those. We exhaust the capabilities of the tools that we're using, or the concepts that we're using, and then we have to invent new ones. But at the time, the theories that we're using are good enough, right? Like, for example, we used to think that light propagated through ether, right? Now, even though that was completely wrong, it didn't stop us from being able to from understanding, what am I trying to say here? It didn't stop us from doing some cosmological stuff. Like, it didn't really matter if light traveled through ether or not. We could still make predictions about gravitational lensing, perhaps, or whatever. So it's something that's, I guess, kind of true universally, that our concepts they cannot adequately, or they cannot represent whatever they're mapping onto entirely, but they can do so in a way that is good enough, and good enough means survival a lot of the time. That's like the
yeah. I mean, I think that also goes back to something that was quite, I think, controversial in terms of certain conversations that Peterson had with Sam Harris about the nature of truth, right? And I think it's one of those things that's very difficult for people to wrap their minds around, because of the fact that it is inherently circular. And we've spent thousands of years convincing ourselves that circular logic is bad logic because it's circular, right? And circularity is bad. Well, this is the issue where one realizes that anytime one creates an axiomatic framework, we've sort of pulled a little trick, right? Where we've artificially broken the circularity that would otherwise have to be there. And then just push that circularity onto something like obvious perception or obvious evidence, empirical reality, right? A straight line in Euclid's time was straight because it was obviously straight on the surface of the earth when you drew it, and you could draw it a million times, and you drew those two parallel lines and they would not intersect with one another, right? Well, we know that actually that's not necessarily the case in four-dimensional space-time. But that depends on, like you said, being able to move from the context in which the initial axioms were created, and then those gave rise to an entire field of geometry, which was very rich in terms of its ability to understand Euclidean space and rigid body dynamics within Euclidean space, and gave us a much better grasp upon this world in some ways, right? But it also changed the way that we thought of the world. And then there's this interesting interplay between what the tools you create enable in terms of behavior, and also how the way they change the way you see the world impacts the way you use those tools, right? And this is one of those interesting points, which I think is one of the things that people choke on most when someone like Peterson talks about if you take the pragmatic perspective all the way to its into its logical conclusion, and say that, well, if your idea of truth or if your idea of accuracy leads you to create things that are self-terminating, then in a way that's a sort of falsity in which the axioms you were operating on destroyed themselves, right? And then out of that, you can start to work towards a kind of evolutionary morality, in the sense that the kind of behaviors that are moral with respect to the agency we have over our use of technology are those behaviors that are in concordance with the ability for the game to be played and iterated across time in a way that not only sustains itself, that's just the base condition, the base necessity, but above and beyond the base necessity of sustainability or recursion, ideally this game also self-enriches. And this is this interesting aspect of systems that simultaneously become more complex and, in theory, more stable, as opposed to those which, as they complexify, also add complications and therefore often collapse under the weight of their complications. And so, this whole picture of evolution and adaptation and morality and the interaction between our creations and the way we think about and perceive the world, all of this is encoded into this really unique, but sometimes difficult to wrap one's head around idea of pragmatic truth.
Yeah. So I guess there's a few of the things you mentioned, particularly around how this increase in complexity can either result in, degradation, or it can stabilize and then lead to greater complexity and order. And I think that really characterizes where we are at the time that we are living in right now, with interconnected global society and the perils that we face. But I think I'd like to come to cover that towards perhaps the end of the conversation. To begin with, I think how do you, if you were to, and this, I'm giving you a tough question because I think this is I don't think even the man
The
himself.
only ones worth thinking about, man.
Yeah. But how would you, if you were to summarize Jordan Peterson's viewpoint, but in particular, what he speaks about with regards to chaos and order and the worlds that we live in, and how we interact with these two, you could say, primordial entities or concepts. What do you think is the fundamental point or observation in how we, in what I would say is our, like the ethic that has kind of emerged, but also is embedded or within ourselves, within, you know, life, or even just human society?
Yeah, I mean, you're kidding. So
I have my own ideas about it, so you don't need to give it all, but like, you don't need to go.
Certainly. I mean, if I were going to try to be as concise as I could be while still retaining accuracy and also deferring to anyone who I'm trying to characterize in terms of their desire to correct anything I've said, right? If I say anything that doesn't actually resonate, I would be happy to be corrected. But based on my reading of his work and of the things that he's stated publicly, I would assume, you know, to me, there's a deep relationship between, you know, the archetypal ideas as represented by chaos as that which is capable of dissolving or destroying, but also renewing and birthing, right? And its interplay with, you know, order, which is that which is capable of crystallizing or creating patterns that are sustainable and also perpetuating those same patterns. And the fact that those two are always in dialogue with one another in any living system, and that the very process of living, or what we identify as life, is in essence the interplay of those two forces. And this is also why things like the yin yang symbol and the notion of Taoism figure so heavily as well in his descriptions of the way that, you know, these archetypal forces interact. And, you know, that's also why the Taoists felt this, because they were looking at this idea of forces that simultaneously are constantly engaged with one another, the interplay of chaos and order constantly giving rise to the pattern and experience that we find ourselves within, but also this other interesting characteristic of each of those tendencies, wherein pushing too far into either of the extremities of either the chaos or the order of a given system will tend to give rise to the antithesis, right? So seeking for too much order relative to what is actually adaptive will very quickly throw your civilization or your household or your mind into chaos. Seeking for too much chaos, the dissolution of what is, simply because one dislikes it from their perspective, holds within itself a great potential for disorder and chaos. And that can lead to either, you know, opportunities for growth or dramatic collapses. So you could say, I think the Game of Thrones expression for it was like chaos is a ladder, right? You could look at it as this discontinuity as an opportunity for growth, which can be true and is true. But it can also, if you miss that window, if you don't thread the needle correctly, that chaotic discontinuity also becomes the sort of pit into which you can very easily fall, and all order that you didn't even realize you relied upon dissociates and crumbles beneath your feet. And that's a very destabilizing idea. And then looking at that interplay and generalizing it to both generalizing it to more social phenomenon, and then also showing how it emerges from evolutionary biology. You know, I think that's kind of the core of the mind of Jordan Peterson, if you will, right? Like that's which is one of the reasons why I resonated with him, because after studying a lot of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology and trying to, you know, I found him before he was controversial because I was studying people who were trying to apply, who were trying to bridge the connection between our narrative stories and our narrative encodings of the world through the religious lens, and bridge those with evolutionary game theory, because that's what I was doing at the time. I was really interested in that, and that's how I came across him. So, I mean, I don't know, that's sort of my lens into his core mode of thought. But yeah, you can tell me what you think.
I think that's a really good characterization of it. Like I'm impressed with how well you managed to cover that, because I think you're bang on. And one of the reasons why I think we may be coming at it from different perspectives, but I think we're both perhaps equally interested in it, is because I think it's fundamentally true, and it maps onto our understanding of the universe as it is. You know, thermodynamical laws, you know, the like entropy, how life seems to well, it takes energy in and tries to minimize entropy locally. And there's this, if we think about these notions of chaos and order through this, you know, entropic informational lens, then I think these ideas, which I think really are at the root of our morality or our ethics, through these lenses, I think we can make huge ground in how we not only live our own lives, but how we structure our societies. So when you spoke of, you know, order having a seed of chaos and chaos having seeds of order within it, you know, as represented, you know, by the yin yang symbol, the thing about order is there's always something out there that can threaten us, right? Like order is the bounded space that is predictable and that we know.
Well, it's analogous to what we were talking about with respect to science, or a given limit of a particular frame of understanding.
Exactly. And to ensure order across time, given that we exist in this bounded space and that there are threats that not only our own actions can give rise to through, you know, just our own interactions, but also just the wider world around us, we need to move into the realm of chaos, to that which we don't understand, and extract information, useful information from that realm to increase local order. And that is exactly what life seems to do. There's this idea that I came across, I think late last year, and it's called the free energy principle. And it's basically this idea or this observation. I don't think it's quite testable so much, but I think it's been highly useful. And it's that all of life seems to have an internal model of the world, like a representation of the organism itself and how it is embedded in the world. And that model seeks to minimize surprise. So it's very pragmatic. It's not about representing the world as it is. It's about representing the world in a way that minimizes its surprise. And, you know, with surprise, we can think of that as just, you know, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding risk. If you're not going to be surprised, if you're minimizing for surprise, you're able to navigate the world in such a way that most likely ensures your survivability across time. And this is something that's is seen, you know, in all organisms, from what I can understand. And it's particularly, I think it's given rise to why Homo sapiens has actually ascended as a species, because we have evolved the capacity for abstract representation, right? I think this is why we've progressed so much. It's because we've been able to abstract things from the world, give them concepts, and then work with those. And those concepts, while they may be, you know, very abstract, like these ideas of chaos and order, or you know, the idea of friendship or whatever, they empower us to, and, you know, through science and all of that, to increase our understanding of the world around us, minimize uncertainty, and create a better world for all of us. So I think that his notions of chaos and order and the interplay of those and how they're fundamental is actually true from a material standpoint. And that by standing on the border of chaos and order, we actually maximize information processing or information flow, and are better equipped to deal with the world around us. And I think this has been shown, like, in a number of different areas. Like, I think the brain tries to stand at that point on the boundary between chaos and order, like criticality. And I think this has been experimentally verified. I can't remember, but it's just one of the reasons. I know I went on a bit of a ramble there, but I think it's just why it's so fascinating, because I think this is the first time in my experience that an understanding of the physical world can inform our ethical decision making to a certain degree.
So, yeah, there are a lot of directions to go there, and it depends on how technical we want to go. I would say, just maybe we'll work backwards. I would say that because the last thing you said there was, I think, perhaps one of the only things that you said in that entire elocution that I'm not quite as on board with, because I do think that's what we've been trying to do for the entire duration of our conscious codification of the world within representations. I do think that we've been attempting to distill and codify patterns that we recognize as transcendent, beyond ourselves, what I would characterize as something like a Platonic process as opposed to a Platonic structure, the kind of process that seems to play itself out or govern the interaction of things across scales and across periods of time, regardless of what kinds of things we're talking about, or how long we're talking about, whether we're talking about the evolution of galaxies or whether we're talking about the social interaction of individual human beings. And so, I do think we've been trying to grapple with those representations for the entire course of human representational history. I think that we're sort of biased towards thinking a lot of those early representations were in some way laughably crude. But in the frame in which those people were creating them, they were certainly not laughably crude, and we're increasingly recognizing many ways in which they were universal, right? And actually, some ways that these understandings, even though we think that we passed them by, keep reintroducing themselves, right? As you see, in terms of the more information theoretic perspective on things, I don't know if you're aware of Alex Wisner-Gross or his causal entropic forces perspective on this. He was a physicist or mathematical physicist. He studied at MIT, very bright guy, created his own artificial intelligence company, I think, based on some of these ideas. But he was trying to codify algorithmically a lot of what you're talking about in terms of looking at and modeling an actual agent, whether it's a person or an animal, in terms of can you create a very general representation of what it would mean for something to behave in a way that looks intelligent to us, right? And he created an algorithm that was able to essentially just look at the degree to, like, it is essentially the ability to minimize surprise by understanding and analyzing the various types of trajectories, and just trying to maximize its ability to maintain degrees of freedom or optionality, so to speak, right? So maintain its optionality behavior while not putting itself in positions of maximum surprise that could damage its optionality of behavior. And that behavior was defined very generally, such that the algorithm can be mapped to anything from trying to, giving the algorithm to like a piece of like a model of like a little platform that has a pendulum inverted on it and trying to balance the pendulum, right? So it has to move so that the pendulum doesn't fall. Or, even develop use that algorithm to show that the very basic logic of this causal entropic forces model was also sufficient if you added multiple agents into the system for cooperative dynamics to emerge, even out of what one might consider something a self-interested agent, right? So they could actually start cooperating to achieve particular kinds of goals, like two agents moving a ball into a space that could only be done by two agents, right? And these algorithms are now and these perspectives are now being generalized by companies like Google and others, and extended into sort of more social game theory to model all of the various possible interaction dynamics. I think it was like the NVIDIA and Google collaboration, where they were, instead of just very low resolution models, they actually had like little computer simulations of individual agents trying to play certain games in a little video game. And then they zoom out and you see that the one game is taking place in the space of all possible games, all being played out in massively parallel game space, with these little agents exploring kind of like this multiversal hypothesis of, all the possible paths of behavior. And then the machine learning algorithm is effectively using that information to then understand not only what the most effective paths are for pursuing the obvious goals, but also using those to innovate in weird creative solutions that none of the humans would have predicted to these games. So, I mean, it's fascinating that these truths, as you're pointing out, they hold across so many different levels and generalize so well. I mean, that doesn't seem random at all. And, it has so much to do with, this notion of entropy, which from the information theoretic perspective is the minimization of surprise, at least locally. But then there's also this question of, the second law is dictating that, generally, more broadly speaking, the entropy of the system is going to have to increase for the local system to actually gain more order. You're going to have to put that waste energy out into the system, and then, or the larger system. And so then this question becomes one of, okay, well, if we're increasingly intelligent and increasingly capable of ordering our local environment, we still find ourselves right back in the sort of yin-yang Taoism of the fact that at some point, unless we assume everything is infinite and we can infinitely both obtain energy and project waste heat, we start becoming subject to our own disorder, right? And then the question of like what the boundary of that is just one of what scale you're thinking about for the problem at hand. So right now, one of the big issues is, okay, well, what's happening with the linearized processes of energy combustion that we have, which are then putting certain forms of waste into the environment and essentially increasing entropy in the environment. And you can then look at potentially the sort of social chaos that might ensue from some of the more catastrophic possibilities in terms of climatological shifts or change as a sort of direct representation of this desire for local order, giving or adding to the larger system in which it's a part of greater disorder and chaos that we were not sufficiently capable of foreseeing or incorporating into the initial processes at hand, or we're in the process of trying to figure out how to do so. So, but like, again, you can represent that archetypally and it works just as well. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating space to pick all this apart, and I'm sure we could do it for hours.
Yeah. Just on that point, from us creating habitable order through, the usage of combustion engines, for instance, and that giving rise to potential chaos in the form of, biosphere collapse or, climate change and all of that. If we manage to sort that problem out, there's this, this spiral of prosperity in a way. But it could be seen as a proxy for it would be just the increase in complexity of our societies. Like, I think complexity, however we want to measure it, is like a good representation. Well, is the representation of how ordered a system is. So that seems to be like one of the metrics, for lack of a better term, of progress. Like how ordered is the system, and that's where I see us. That's the problem. That's where we're at right now, where we've got these problems emerging from just what could be seen as fundamentally good actions. Like the creation of the combustion engine in cars and electricity and all of that has done tremendous amounts of good for human beings, right? And if you think about Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now and how things have never been so good, while that is the case, from these actions come potential consequences that we now need to deal with. So like the pendulum has kind of swung in the other direction, from us having to what am I trying to say here? Now that we've created a world, and I don't really know how to phrase this, but we need a different set of thinking. We need to now reckon with the consequences of the actions that have been very much so positive, but in order for this to be sustained across time, we need to kind of consolidate and develop structures and frameworks that enable us to continue this level of progress without large-scale catastrophe in the near future.
Yeah, so rewinding to the definition, or like the metricization of complexity, so to speak. This is something I've written about a little bit and have done some work on, and also very much agree with, in the sense that I think one of the best metrics, one of the most pragmatic metrics for us to take into consideration, or to begin, through which we should begin to view our behavior at all scales, both individually as well as in our families and in our societies and in our larger sort of species level interactions with the world at scale, is the capacity to increase complexity, maintain or increase the complexity of the systems we create and in which we're embedded, to increase that complexity so basically to maintain or increase that complexity without sacrificing its own sort of metastability, right? Its own capacity to renew and regenerate itself. And we shouldn't get too far into the weeds, but I've been doing a lot of research into ways of looking at sort of symmetry of fractal patterns in processes across time, to be able to extract a metric of how, so sort of the evolution of stable complexity across time. So I very much agree with that. And then if we take that metric and we start applying it to the behaviors in question that we were talking about, and that maybe this will help to put more words around the idea that you were pointing to, is this notion that, just like we were talking about earlier, it's very rarely the case that we're able to take either mass or energy from a living system that's already self-sustaining, such as, for example, an ecosystem or a forest, or some sort of aspect of a much larger cyclic process, right? And even when we're talking about fossil fuels, those fossil fuels are embedded in our earth because of much larger cyclic processes, right? And we're extracting and linearizing something that was once cyclical. When we extract from a cyclic process or self-sustaining process, we are most often turning something that is complex in that space into something that is merely complicated in our own space of creations. So we're oftentimes reducing net complexity through, at least locally, through our creations, and turning things that can, for example, regenerate themselves through the process of reproductive, sexual evolution, into things that can't. Like, if I show you like this tablet right here, like it's not going to reproduce any tablets, which is like one of the major distinctions between the kinds of technologies that evolution has given rise to and the kinds of technologies that humanity has thus far given rise to. And so this is why there's this massive jump that's required of us in terms of taking all of the complications that we are creating in the world that are very useful in terms of increasing and stabilizing our own local order, and turning those or transforming those into systems that can reintegrate those flows of energy and materials into the ecosystems and contexts from which they once took, in a way that allows both of those forms of complexity to equilibrate first and then rise together in a way that is actually mutually reinforcing. Or one of my favorite sort of $10 words is autocatalytic, right? Which is like a mutually catalyzing relationship in which the interactions, the outputs of one of them feed the inputs of the other, and then the outputs of the other feed the inputs of the first, right? And you get this self-reinforcing process that actually maps very closely to the origin of life itself, in terms of most of our research of how life itself emerged. And so what I'm getting at here is that all of these arrows are beginning to point towards the fact that we need to catalyze an event that is much like the original event that itself gave rise to living or self-reproducing systems out of mere molecules. And and we need to begin thinking about our systems design in that way, through that lens, which is why I'm so interested in this category of thinking of sort of emergent systems design, because that's exactly the lens through which I view it. It's a necessary task, and either we learn to do this or we eventually, the game ends for us. So.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it all. I guess we've kind of seen humanity has been very, very anthropocentric in its thinking, and we see and I remember growing up this way, like not even really caring that much for the natural world around me, because like the only stuff that's important is the human world, and that sort of thinking that has I guess you could say characterized us, and it has its roots in the fact that we think that we are in representations of God, and that we are almighty because we are capable of doing so much more than perhaps some of our animalian relatives, at least from one perspective, that we are separate from them. But like, I think as we're starting to see now, especially with movements like Extinction Rebellion and just the global challenges that we face that affect all of us, that we are deeply and inextricably embedded within the biosphere, the earth, and that the sooner we recognize this, and I'd say even more importantly, represent that in our constitutions and our laws, the sooner we do that, the better, because I think it's necessary for the long-term survivability and thriving of our species. And the question of, like, you're saying, how do we engineer these, you want to look into how do we engineer these emergent systems. The specifics of like understanding how these systems operate and how they flow is one thing, but actually trying to catalyze the social movement that's necessary is also important, because we could have all the tools that I think all the tools are kind of out there. Like, there's a lot of people who are working on these sorts of things, but we lack the social momentum, for lack of a better term. We need a way of like taking this information and putting it in people's minds, and then saying this is, and trying to bring about these changes democratically in some way. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of our time, because the knowledge that we have at our disposal is incredible, right? Each of us has access to the library of the world through the internet. I don't think a lack of knowledge or information is the problem. It's a matter of sense making. It's a matter of disseminating that information, ensuring that people are on the same pages in a way, and catalyzing action based upon that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I think that I'm spending a lot of my time at the moment attempting to develop some tools that I hope will help with some of that. I think there's a deeper pattern that's let's say you're trying to catalyze this process. Well, as long as, so like, imagine, like, what's the fundamental goal, right? Like, this goal is people are embedded in their lives locally. A lot of those people embedded in their local daily lives, they don't feel pain or suffering associated with the possible future that may be coming their way if they themselves don't spend some of their time and energy thinking or contributing to these greater problems, right? So there's a little bit of a catch-22 where it's how do you get someone to care? How do you get people to extend their sphere of, both in time and space, of consideration, right? How does one extend their sphere of consideration? And oftentimes this is a process of building up sort of psychological and emotional stability, economic capacity, and this is one of these reasons why you see development so frequently associated with increased environmental awareness, right? Where you have these periods where people are very dirty, so to speak, in terms of our side effects, until you start passing a certain point at which people gain the luxury to begin thinking about these side effects further in space and time. But then there's this question of like, well, is it going to happen quickly enough, right? And like, what is the rate of change necessary in terms of people's individual behaviors that ladder up into larger social patterns of, like, for example, energy demand. What is that rate of change over time relative to our perceived necessary rate of change relative to a given problem, right? So it's like, how quickly do we think we need to move relative to how quickly do we actually move? And it's a very tricky problem. It's like, the harder you think, like the more you think about the problem, the harder it becomes to really understand how much we really know about the way that our behaviors will unfold across time, what we're really capable of in any given time frame if we actually need to do something, and then also our ability to assess the seriousness or the risk associated with certain actions, using the current tools that we have at our available to us at the moment, which is something that's a whole, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, because I think this plays a massive role that is largely invisible to most people. The way that we interact with information presently, I think, has a lot to do with the inability to transform concern into sustainable action that does actually ladder up in a material and pragmatic way, a durable way across time. I think the majority of the way that the current modes of communication and our current social media activity, the way that they channel or catalyze information flows, ironically, it's also this linear model where it ends up with just a bunch of waste heat that doesn't really produce a lot of meaningful, durable artifacts or outputs. And so what would it look like to have what would it look like to have information systems that simultaneously allow for us to make sense of reality through more distributed sense-making systems and the flow of information analogous to what we have now on social media, but that also incorporates this question of accountability, this question of what are you doing about it, not what are you saying about it, what are you actually spending your time doing, building, creating, who are you helping? Like, how do you begin to bridge that gap? Because right now it's far too easy for people to get the psychological feedback they want without doing the hard work required to make any meaningful change, and then also treat everybody else who's not working on the exact problem that they're working on from the same perspective that they're working on it from, treat those other people as if they are, the primary threat to human survival, and therefore generate a lot more contention and animosity than is otherwise necessary.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what these systems, what they might look like, and how we might engineer them. It just makes me think that the attention economy has what we're incentivized to do is just signal positive things, and we get rewarded through likes and all that. And from those interactions, there's a second order effect of, if we have ways of monetizing those interactions through sales of books or all of that. That's I don't think the incentives are aligned well enough to bring about the sorts of actions that we need. And it's just it's very easy just to signal, to virtue signal, to say like, oh, this is what we should be doing, blah, 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 without actually translating that into action.
Yeah.
So,
well, the whole model is it's based off this paradigm of like signal, generate a reaction, and then extract some sort of local economic gain based on the reaction you generated. Right? Whether you're a new media company, or whether people are making inflammatory videos on YouTube, or whatever sort of game that someone's running on Twitter in terms of their persona and charging for ebooks or whatever people are doing this along so many different dimensions, whether it's the manosphere or feminism or whatever. Everyone's running their own little game in terms of presumably bettering the world, but in reality, oftentimes it doesn't ladder up into anything other than someone increasing their own status or extracting some sort of micropayment, so to speak, from the society at large. And so then the question is, well, what does it actually look like for people to network together in a way where we hold each other accountable to meaningful outputs that actually ladder up into projects that move toward our image of a desired future? And I think we're figuring that out. We're still trying to figure that out. People are testing the waters. People are creating new systems, new options, new ways of making sense that are learning these lessons from sort of the risks we've introduced in the first wave of social media. Yeah, and we're mid-experiment. We'll see where this starts to move.
Yeah. So what sort of tools are you aware of, or what are you working on in particular? And I'm really curious about how this feeds into ideas of money, because, money is like one of the largest incentives we have. And it seems to be like, there's a reason why people engage in these games to, get attention and then try to sell things, and it's survival, right? I feel like there's this big clash that a lot of people feel today. I mean, I think we were speaking a bit about it at the start of this. It's like, there's the things I want to be doing, and then there's that which is financially viable. And the trick that many of us, or the game that many of us seem to be playing or moving towards, is trying to get that alignment there so that we can be doing things that are net beneficial to the world, but also allow us to survive. Like, I think this conversation is, I would say, hopefully contributing to the good of the world, but I'm not really receiving a means of, I can't survive just off doing these conversations as of yet. So how do you see these, how do you see us creating tools to create this alignment, and how does money fit into the equation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge conversation. That relates quite a bit to some of the things that I've written and published online around the evolution of our monetary systems and what are really, at a fundamental level, systems that we use for representing value in the world, right? How do we represent, because the fundamental, I mean, we should probably, before going too deeply into it, I view this, I like to think of many different kinds of systems. So including the evolution of language, including the evolution of money, including certain ways of representing art and value, but largely linguistic and monetary, as something of a coherence, a coherence mechanism is something that it's a phrase I think is quite appropriate. And what I mean by a coherence mechanism is that if you look at the fundamental problem of attempting to scale social groups, is you have this issue where if you and I are walking together and we spend every moment together and we live together, we eat together, we hunt together, we do everything together, there is no accounting problem, right? We know each other. We have very rich mental models of one another, and there's no divergence there, right? That being said, it's also somewhat limiting for you and I to have to remain completely coupled to one another throughout time. And so the entire process of social evolution and social scaling and complexification has been this process of developing ways to solve that fundamental tension, such that we are simultaneously capable of bringing the information, so freeing individuals within our social systems to explore more of reality, whether that's physical reality, whether that's conceptual or abstract reality, social reality, the space of ideas, the space of new possible technologies. How do you free people to explore that while also retaining the capacity for the network of individuals to have a kind of collective agency together, such that those trust relationships are preserved, such that people can believe that the representations that other people are putting forward, as in regard to their past, their present, and their desired future, how can we believe and trust that those are accurate, right? And so then we have all of these different solutions and different social trajectories of evolution in terms of, well, how do we solve those sort of accounting problems as societies grow? And without going into the entire history of money, I could just refer people to the essays that I wrote in terms of.
Yeah, I'll link them.
Yeah. There's this fundamental issue where we've come to a place now where we have very low resolution representations. We have, here in the United States, we have the dollar, right? I'm not sure where you are at the moment. Are you in Australia at the moment? Or?
Yeah, Australian dollar.
Also the dollar, the Australian dollar. And so, and in different countries, we have different unitary abstractions that we've decided to use to represent effectively all possible forms of human value, right? And the reason that we got here in the way that we did fundamentally is because we optimized for the representations of value that reduce transactional friction, right? We increased the flow, right? So if you wanted to go into a marketplace when we were first developing, 10,000, 15,000 years ago, when we were first starting to scale city-state level structures, and you actually had people coming from different cultures and different locations with different value systems, what was the common denominator that allowed for, and that minimized transactional friction, and that allowed for the sort of economic metabolism within that space to actually emerge and stabilize? Well, what we did is we made a sort of sacrifice, and we said, listen, all these ways that we were representing the unique traits of these different kinds of value in our life, we're going to begin homogenizing them. We didn't do that explicitly, right? We did it pragmatically, we did it functionally, we did it because it worked at first, and then it worked quite well for a while. But then there's this question of, okay, well, is there a sort of potential function of like lost value that also grows alongside the compression of your symbols for representing value? And so I think we've brought ourselves to a place where the games that we play and the way that we represent value in our world have dramatically separated themselves from the world of values that the human being understands innately, right? And so that's why it's so easy for people to recognize that, and also it's so easy for people to blame money as the sort of corrupting factor in the world, right? Because fundamentally, if you're going to represent all value only using money, first of all, you're going to miss out on a lot of human value. And second of all, you also open up this weird space, which I think is also common to many systems, many representative systems that are like this. You open up this space where people begin to play a metagame. Like presumably there's a connection between behavior, actual people's behavior, somebody growing a potato or somebody creating a software application that improves people's lives, or someone doing something that produces something meaningful. Presumably there's a direct connection between that and the abstract representation of that value that they then accumulate and can use for other goods or services. And there's always some connectivity there, but what happens when you begin to play a game where instead of actually playing a game where generating more of that value or getting more of those value symbols requires creating actual value, if you're able to decouple those, ideally the best world from the perspective of someone who just wants to acquire those symbols is to gain the symbols without adding the value. That's the cheapest way to get the money, right? And so because it's the cheapest way to get the money, because it's the path of least resistance, we see entire industries popping up around effectively purely either extracting those symbols without adding back any value to the system, or inflating the space of those symbols so that they can more easily have more themselves before that inflation cascades through the rest of the system, right? So we see these fundamental issues with the way that we represent value. First of all, it cuts off a lot of human values that we actually care about but don't represent. And second of all, it encourages the playing of extremely parasitic and destabilizing games. And we're in a position in our society right now where we're sort of, I think, at the end of our rope along both of those dimensions. We can no longer afford to not represent other aspects that we value in our representative tools, such as our currencies. And simultaneously, we are extremely top heavy in terms of the amount of economic growth that is, in our representations of economic growth that comes from purely these sort of inflationary or extractive gains that have very little to do with the hard underlying problems of real value creation. And so then the question is like, how do we make that transition? And I think a lot of it has to do with the experiments that we're running right now with alternative currencies, the way that because all that is really like from the deepest perspective that I can muster is a different way of talking about value. And we're experimenting with a different way of talking about value and a different way of managing, like taking the management of the system of value itself and its evolution and trying to subject it to some sort of non-arbitrary evolutionary rule set that is outside the hands of corruptibility, right? So can you create systems that can transcend governance structures that are obviously captured or obviously corrupted, right? which is why one of the things that I think is most interesting about Bitcoin is that I really do believe it's the first supranational infrastructure, right? Really supranational distributed infrastructure that couldn't be destroyed fully by any state if that state wanted to, and threw its full effort at it. Now, some people would argue with that perspective, but it is very interesting that we've seeded something, it has taken root, and it has effectively become global, and it is thus far operating in a way that is beyond this nation state paradigm. And I think that's a fascinating first step towards the next paradigm of systems that are capable simultaneously of self-directed evolution, right? At a scale far beyond the kind of government or governance systems that can be captured, as well as the kinds of systems that you can build on top of that, which allow for us to begin including far more signals with respect to our values, with respect to the ways that we perhaps create economic networks with each other, the way that we map our representations of value to the need for certain goods, right? So then we can start saying, you know, and I know this is a long way to answering the initial parts of your question, which is like, how can I eat based on my podcast? Right. But like, if we want to talk about like, how can we eat based on the podcast, what you need is some sort of, again, once we start looking at economic networks as metabolic processes, right? You then begin to understand that, okay, well, it no longer makes sense to have these extremely specialized structures where I rely for my food on a massive supply chain with 8 different nodes in between, each of which is trying to get a cut. The farmer gets nothing. I pay a high price. I have no transparency in terms of what happens in between, what it's subjected to, whether it, you know, is treated well, whether it's properly refrigerated, whether it's going to threaten my health, whether it abides by my own ethics, any of these things, right? I don't know that. So then the question is like, is it possible to simultaneously reduce the length of those chains, but then also incorporate those higher fidelity connections in sort of intentional network structures that people build themselves emergently, right? Like how do you actually create a network where, you know, you produce something that the farmer wants? Like, this is what markets are for, right? Because we don't want it to be centrally controlled, because we're not really capable of that. But then if you entirely disintermediate, or if you entirely decentralize just using something as simple as currency, you get all these other side effects, negative side effects that I was talking about. So like, what is this hybrid in between where you're able to sort of sort of like emergently design or co-create intentional networks that are capable of self-sustaining, right? And what are the scale limitations to those? Because to be completely honest, like, at least at first, the capacity of a network like that, like if you and me and 100 other people wanted to create a sort of self-sustaining economic network, the average capacity of that, or the ability of that network to produce something like a MacBook Pro, we wouldn't be able to do that, right?
Yeah.
So there's this really interesting question, I think, of experimenting with these structures, beginning from the bottom up, which is why I'm also really interested in like sort of the next phase of my life, or the next year or two after I get married later this year, is actually moving into this space of trying to see how much I can live a life that is sort of heavy on both sides of the abstraction spectrum. So like, on one hand, spend some amount of time really close to the earth, the biological processes that are necessary to fulfill my actual life. But then simultaneously, instead of the traditional farm, which is associated with people who are not that economically integrated into the higher abstraction, higher value add, so to speak. And I don't really believe that, because fundamentally everyone needs to eat. So we say it's not value add, but we all then get hungry. So let's be real, like actually farming and creating food is quite valuable. But then there's this other higher ROI per unit time kind of work, that's information work, that's usually perceived as disconnected from that more ecologically in touch work. And is it possible to sort of have a better, have a life that's actually in touch with both of those, right? And then if more people are doing that, what is possible and what can emerge from that, where first you're sort of taking energy flows out of the current the current system that relies heavily on this hyper specialization and massive scaling using current low or high abstraction monetary systems, is it possible to siphon that over time to grow these other networks such that as you grow, you never actually, one can replace the other over time without ever actually losing capacity, right? So we never lose the ability to generate computers, for example, or something like that. And that goes back to our idea of don't destroy complexity that exists, right? Keep and increase the complexity, but make sure that it stabilizes. So then how do you then transition slowly over to these more distributed forms of self-sustaining, one might call it more like ecologically integrated societies that take advantage of the information technologies that we have, and the fact that we can actually do a lot now without physically congregating in space and time. We don't need, we can have a sort of, if you look at people, if you read people like Jeffrey West, who talks about, he wrote the book Scale, physicist at the Santa Fe Institute, mathematical physicist, something like that. He talks a lot about the dynamics of cities as these engines of innovation, which is true. But the interesting thing about that is okay, that's physical space, but can we not still conceptualize the same pattern of aggregating and coming together in abstract informational space now that we have the ability to connect like we're doing right now? I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. There is a city in the sky insofar as the world of Twitter or whatnot floats above the world of the physical, right? It's the biggest city, right? You just look at the number of users, right? And you consider that a city, it would be the largest city on the planet, right? And so beginning to think of these systems in those ways, and I know there's sort of a scattershot mosaic of ideas. And it's not there's no final answer to this, but
yeah. Well, we're in the exploration mode.
Yeah, it's an active process of my thinking. I guess it's just sort of a window. I'm just trying to reflect the things that are bumping around in my head as I try to myself figure out how to map these problems onto my own space of actions and solutions. All of that aside, I am also building something myself, which is we're calling it future aligned. Just myself and a friend at the moment building it. And we're starting to take on some testers. But the whole idea of that is to, again, from the bottom up, give people a tool to manage their own personal growth and development in a way that as they do so, first of all, it helps them balance all the different values they have. It's a much more values aligned way of looking at the world. It's you specify your values and then connect the patterns of behavior that you want to incorporate into your life into those values, and then you understand how they balance with respect to each other across time, right? Because it's not as if pursuit of one thing comes at no cost, right? It's always this dynamic balancing evolution of your life and understanding yourself as a behavioral pattern, so to speak, as a values targeting behavioral pattern, as opposed to some sort of rational creature that just puts things on a calendar and executes them. Or follows some recipe for behavior. And, if you just have 6-pack abs, everything else in your life will take care of itself. And everyone knows that that's bullshit, right? So first of all, how do we make a system that allows for people to see their own personal development, personal growth through that lens? It allows for people to build these things themselves. So part of it is, well, how do you build this landscape of behavior yourself? And how do you build that representation? And then you can have other people use the one, if it's effective for you, you can have other people use that same sort of value, right? That same sort of landscape of behaviors. And then ideally, what we want to do is allow a real embodied social network to form around that. Not the sort of social network where you can just easily connect to anyone online at any distance, but that you would actually connect to people you really connect with in your life. And then you can start aligning behaviors and values such that it makes it easy to work together on things that are values aligned across time, to actually generate and represent the artifacts of that over time as you produce things together. And then the picture that emerges as more and more people do this is an actual representation of this collective emerging values aligned space of producing real artifacts, real things, working towards real goals and demonstrating their proof of work, right? And then, you can imagine all the things that one could do with that if it existed, right? Because in the world of, for example, like LinkedIn, like that's another big signaling game where the cost of fake signaling is very low generally. And people, you don't really know what people are doing, and people don't really put, people don't really put skin in the game, so to speak, when it comes to that representation that they put out into society. And it's going to remain that way until some sort of harder currency comes along and displaces it. And so, we're really interested in that sort of trajectory for what we're building.
Do you see the creation of? I mean, we've already seen it over the past few years with the whole crypto boom and bust, or just like the whole crypto wave. Do you see that these taking shape, these little subsystems that are connected to the greater whole, as having unique tokens or currencies that are in some way interchangeable with the global energy flow or currency flow? Like I want to think about this, as you said, in terms of, metabolic terms, because I think, if we view the flow of currency or the flow of money through the lens of energy and information, I think it'll really do us quite a lot of, it'll be very beneficial because, if you think about it, like energy, it's the flow of money is space filling in a way, because everyone needs to get access to it, because it enables, if you think of people as like individual cells, they need the energy, they need some form of money to survive. And I'm just curious about how you see the need for high resolution local representation of value mapping onto the global requirements, and how they flow and how they may transition. Because something that will make sense to a lot of people, including myself, is like right now we don't really have a global currency, but we have lots of different currencies that are kind of like the US is kind of the US dollar is kind of the standard global currency in a way. It's the one that we kind of compare to, but there is no single global currency that we all exchange and use as a way of, I guess, comparing our own unique currencies, or like that of Bitcoin, or the Australian dollar, the yen, whatever. So how do you see this taking shape? And is currency perhaps the wrong way of thinking about it?
I mean, currency is one way of thinking about it. And I think I would be very surprised if humanity were able to adapt in the ways necessary while simultaneously moving beyond representations. It's very difficult for me to imagine that. I think the only path, and that's what currencies are, right? That's this coherence mechanism that allows for our individual perspectives to be represented to one another, even if we don't know one another, right? Within, and held within this system of trust that means that there's at least we share some modicum of mutual understanding of value, right? Like the fact, even if our society doesn't agree on anything else, we're still using dollars, right? That kind of idea. But there's also this question of, okay, well, what would a world have to look like for that not to be the case, where we had certain representational flows that satisfied that problem? And I think what it would have to look like would be a directly mentally connected world in which there was no such thing, or the idea of individual autonomy of mind was so transformed that we would no longer recognize it, right? So I think you can get away without having money if you connect all of the brains directly at high bandwidth with Neuralink or something like that.
Yeah.
But that's a radical supposition, and it's a supposition. It's a deeply ethically concerning supposition for many other reasons. And there's this question of well, it's also back to our earlier conversations. It's also a question of, well, then you do sacrifice some amount of autonomy of perspective and the novelty that comes along with getting that information from all those different perspectives. Now, taking it back to the more realistic layer, assuming that we do still require currencies, as you point out, you do need a degree of liquidity between those. But we're already, in many ways, the crypto, it's fascinating. So 10,000 years ago in a marketplace, you could not go into a market with 10 different currencies and expect for things to go that well. Like if you're trying to transact your business in many currencies, you're going to have to physically or mentally compute these differences. You're going to have to do all these translations. So there's a lot of friction in the system, right? Which is sort of, if you study economics, be a Coasian cost is what it's called, right? So Ronald Coase was this guy who came along and said, hey, listen, economics, you're kind of forgetting about all of the friction in the system that's required at the transactional level or the organizational level. And that's sort of invisible in all of classical economic theory. So why don't we start incorporating this? He did it in the idea of these Coasian costs or transaction cost theory. And so, but now like I can, on my phone, I can have hundreds of different types of currencies that can all seamlessly interact. Then the question is, how do we use that technology? And right now, I think one of the biggest failures of the cryptocurrency community is in a lot of ways a failure of imagination. We're recapitulating a lot of the same patterns that existed previously and compounding them, right? Making them even worse in our first attempts. Now, this is the process of learning, right? So like look at the ICO craze that happened, right? The ICOs were modeled after IPOs, but the idea was do it bottom up instead of top down. But they went into that world without understanding that there was an absolute need for some amount of accountability, as well as some degree of quality filtering. But there was no emergent or bottom up accountability mechanisms or quality filtering mechanisms in place at the time. So what happened? The parasites won that round, basically, yep. Right? It was a highly parasitized round. Many people lost their shirts, and it gave the cryptocurrency world, so to speak, a really bad reputation in some circles, right? Now, people are continuing to learn, people are continuing to build, people are realizing how, that many of these trust mechanisms, it's not about being trustless, it's about encoding trust in the right way with low friction. People are beginning to realize that that a lot of what needs to be done is to replicate some of the previous patterns, but in decentralized ways, as opposed to just have a decentralized free-for-all and things will take care of themselves. Trust doesn't go away, quality doesn't go away, problems of identity don't go away, game theoretic problems don't go away. They all just are, you just have a new tool set to begin approaching the same problems. And so I think month by month, year by year, more and more very high quality thinkers are attracted to these tools as potential tools that can be applied to the problems that they themselves have considered for 5, 10, 15 years. And so we're going to see slowly, and this goes back to this question of like, how fast do we think things should happen versus how fast can they actually happen? I see things from a very zoomed out evolutionary perspective usually. So for me, it's like the problem of cryptocurrency. I just look at it as a paradigmatic shift in the way we represent, the tools we use to represent value that's going to play out over multiple generations, right? Like how long did it take the double entry bookkeeping that was invented in the Venetian markets to make its way around the world and embed itself and completely transform the global trade paradigm, like lifetimes, right? So things are happening faster now, but they're still, I think it's unreasonable to expect that they happen instantaneously. I also think that it's unreasonable to expect that any evolutionary paradigm is going to get it right the first time. It's not how evolution works. Evolution is much more of a scattershot method that attempts to, just like we were talking about earlier with the causal entropic forces model. You model and experiment with many paths and then prune back the ones that work. We can see this model reflected in many different kinds of evolutionary systems, as well as certain organisms themselves, like slime molds. This is why you can use a slime mold to model the Japanese subway systems, because it will basically, I don't know if you've ever seen this, it's a pretty cool.
Yeah, wait, didn't they, I'll let you explain it, but it ended up, they let loose a slime mold in something that resembled Tokyo in some way, and it developed a network that closely resembled Tokyo's actual subway system, because it optimized for energy flow across the system. Yeah,
so they gave it a constraint system, a physical model, and they put food sources at the places where they actually wanted the transportation hubs to exist. And then they injected the slime mold into this, and it effectively radiated outwards many different possible options of direction of growth, once it started to connect to all the food sources, once it connected to all the food sources, it basically prunes itself back, right? And then you've discovered a very efficient or effective pattern that is idealized for that particular topology of food sources or subway stops. And it modeled a lot of what they had modeled alternatively using very expensive computer systems and models, but they did it with a slime mold instead and got a very similar outcome. And so this is how evolution works, and this is how and this is how this is also encoded in the idea of the Cambrian explosion, where we had sometimes you have certain tweaks to a particular molecule or a particular adaptive feature, right, or exaptive feature. Exaptation is this idea of okay, well, the heart didn't evolve to enable the stethoscope to hear it, but inventing the stethoscope means that the heart now has a new function in the world that actually is adaptive, right? In terms of the doctor being able to listen to it and use that acoustic information in a new way, right? So these are these exaptations. So you can have the adaptations or exaptations.
It's using an existing like phenotype or characteristic and using it in a new useful way. Like the tongue, for instance, the tongue wasn't evolved for speech, not as I know it, but now that we have it, we can actually use it for various forms of speech.
Yeah, and then there are some costs, like we can choke on our food, which isn't actually, but it's worth it. Like, right, we can talk, and then some of us die choking. Hopefully not on our own words, right?
Jesus, not on this conversation.
But yeah, so looking at things like cryptocurrencies and looking at social experimentation through that lens. The way that I kind of like to think of it is like, okay, like you have to think of this process of expansion and experimentation and then pruning back, whether it's like how many currencies we're going to end up with or, what technologies that we're going to implement. But then there's this other layer that we have to add to it. Let's call it the Minesweeper layer, right? Where you can imagine that like you want to grow and experiment, but you don't want those experimental tendrils to land on the mines that blow the whole thing to heaven, right? And so then that's this question of existential risk that many people are very concerned with right now in terms of, the lines of adaptation and exploration that we are now opening to ourselves. Are we sufficiently responsible to explore those paths in a divergent fashion without hitting the mine on the minesweeper field and taking out the whole species, right? Are we responsible? Are we sufficiently wise to do this? Obviously, people have different perspectives on that, but the question in my mind is like, well, whether we are or we're not, we're in the game. It's this is the game we're playing, and the price of admission is our lives and the future of our species. So we as Stuart Brand said, it's like we are as gods and might as well get good at it, right? Mm-hmm. And it's more like we must get good at it or the game ends.
This is something that is, I guess, troubled me for, I guess, since I started university, 2012, 2013. And, I spent a lot of time in that period reading things about, just like I was very tech centric, tech and science centric. And I realized that, our technological capabilities have just advanced to just, magical, we have like magical capabilities from the perspectives of, even those from just a few decades ago. Like we can now genetically engineer life, right? And I was thinking like, well, now that we're at this kind of at the helm of spaceship Earth, and how we act has a consequence, not just for ourselves, but for that of all of life. And we have these tools that enable us to do just, absolutely incredible things. And with that comes just such a tremendous amount of responsibility. And the question of how we actually, like what map do we use to inform our actions is one that really needs to be, is like the first thing that we need to figure out before we start even taking actions. Like we need to ensure that we're not going to take actions that result in catastrophic consequences, but also we need to really build a map that works not just for our species, but for all of life and for life that will come. There's a big focus in the effective altruism community about the importance of future people, right? The importance of sentient beings to come. And, while it's incredibly important, We can't, I think we need to really focus on an ethic that doesn't just apply to sentient beings, but also takes into account the entire biosphere, because we will speciate, as things do, as organisms tend to over the years. So as if we look into a thousand years into the future and we've colonized the solar system and all of that, we will most likely speciate. If by our own hand through genetic engineering or just by standard evolutionary processes, then
it depends what we mean by species. The idea of speciation in a world of genetic technology that allows for arbitrary recombination is an interesting definitional tangle. But yeah, with a lot of divergence, a lot of experimentation. Yeah,
a lot of experimentation, and the wants and needs and desires of each of those species, for lack of a better term, will need to be considered, and the context that they are embedded within as well. So we need to discover and codify an ethic for life now, because we are now custodians of the planet. And, if we don't tend to this garden properly, then it just it'll be a cosmic disaster that
So I mean, this is the interesting aspect. These are the interesting aspects of these sort of Platonic processes that I've been so interested in the sense that, like, when you say, there's a couple metaphors in what you were saying in terms of the stewardship of the planet or spaceship Earth, right? Which would sort of embody our entire species as a singular captain-like figure, right? And then the other characterization that you just used at the end of that, which was gardening, right? The idea of tending a garden, and the qualities that are associated with that. And so, and also our species as an emergent singular gardener, so to speak, which is, both of these are these interesting questions of, okay, well, if you look at the archetypal individual in each of those roles, right? The pilot or the captain and the gardener, what are the traits? What are the personality characteristics that you want in those individuals? So in a captain, you want somebody who has a steady hand, is a way of, one way that we've encoded that idea of stability and foresight, and not being overly reactive, and being able to appropriately take in the information and make the right decision at the right time, right? Not act too soon, not act too late, act at the right time, be able to, maintain a particular disposition even when others are losing their shit. And so that archetypal representation, or those qualities of the captain, what does it require of our individual behavior and systems as a species, such that those qualities emerge also at the emergent level of humanity as such? We can do the same activity for the gardener, right? What does the gardener do? Well, the gardener is capable of close observation, of a deep understanding of health, of an understanding of the contingency of health of one thing upon the network of other things in which it resides and upon which it depends. The flows of energy, the flows of, the way that patterns change across time, and what that implies for the health of the systems under consideration. And also, deeper than all of that, a fundamental care structure for life itself, right? Life itself as a process, an appreciation for the rarity and the beauty of that, and understanding that care and that beauty through the lens of responsibility and caretaking. How do you get those qualities as an emergent trait of an entire species? Right? That's why I'm so fascinated with this question of emergent systems design. And I don't necessarily say engineering. I think it's more of an interesting like design and stewardship question. And even it's kind of meta, because it's also a gardening question.
Yeah. Well, the design is like, we design gardens, right? Like we can't control, like, the nature of complex systems is that we just can't predict what's going to happen, but we tend to them and we see what happens and we adjust accordingly. And I think it's the right metaphor for dealing with this issue. But there's also
that brings us back to another Petersonian insight, right? In terms of the representation of Garden of Eden as the fundamental point of interaction between the human consciousness and capacity for the introduction of order within the greater tendency toward entropy and chaos, right?
Yeah. On your point about the navigator, the archetype of the navigator, and I think a big part of this is our ability to chart the seas or to sail the seas of uncertainty, or just to navigate, is dependent upon our ability to interpret the environment, understand it, and act within it, right? And I want to take this idea and then bring it to social networks and the information environments which we find ourselves in. And I saw a tweet of yours, I think from like 4 hours ago even, and it was about specialization. And let me just see what the specific words that we used. Specialization as epistemic speciation, right? So because we live the internet has provided us with the ability to select and create our own infospheres, like our own information environments. And the problem that I think we're seeing is that a lot of those information environments are not compatible, or they don't, there's no coherence between them. And, this is analogous to, specialization in general. Like someone who is deeply specialized in one field may not have the terminology to communicate effectively about general problems with someone from another with someone who is a specialist in another field. So a big problem that I think we're faced with is just the incompatibility of people to communicate with one another, because their information environments have molded them to be just incommensurate with one another.
Yeah, I mean, so let's. This is interesting in the sense that it's one of the reasons why I was attempting to place both language and or grammars and monetary representation systems in this same larger category of coherence mechanisms, because I use that word coherence as to mean the capacity of a system to maintain a dynamic and adaptive stability and balance between the autonomy of its individual agents and its own emergent collective capacity, right? Which are constantly in tension with one another. And the same pattern holds in both of these places that we were talking about, in the sense that, well, when we are observing epistemic or specialization with respect to scientific domains, we are seeing the deepening of an understanding in a narrow slice of our window of concern in reality. And as that occurs, the natural evolution is to speciate, so to speak, the language, to differentiate, to create a grammar that maps very well and very closely to that particular representation, that particular space within our intellectual exploration of the physical world. And yet, as different groups do that in their own directions, there's this question of, well, how do they connect to one another? Which is the exact same question of, at the level of currency, right? How do you say that you can have higher representative dimension for smaller networks or niches of individuals, people or values-aligned individuals, but still allow them to ladder up and communicate coherently as an emergent structure, right? And so it's like, and evolution has been faced with this same process. And again, like the way that it does this is allow for, this is why we see this sort of hierarchical networks emerge, right? Because I think the deeper way of thinking about it, I have this essay that's partly written, but like it's been partly written for a year and a half now. So but it's basically sort of, it's like hierarchies as like processual precipitates. I know that's a mouthful, but it's like, if you look at, like, we see the physical structure, we see the physical pattern of a hierarchy, right? And the archetype of the hierarchy is a pyramid. Well, why is the archetype of the hierarchy a pyramid? Well, I would flip the question on its head and say, well, why did we first see pyramids as representation of the processes that give rise to hierarchy? Because fundamentally, what the processes that give rise to hierarchical structure are processes that mediate between centrality or central positions, and which are more abstracted or larger or more generalized, and all of the different layers of connectivity to increasingly small parts of a given network, right? So that's why you see this sort of scale-free networks emerge, whether you're talking about giant hubs on social media, these connectors, or whether you're talking about the human circulatory system and the branching and the way that all of our blood does flow through and is pumped by our heart. But if you look at the actual levels of fractal differentiation, there's a very specific logic to exactly how deep the individual capillary or the blood needs to go, or the structures need to differentiate so that it can actually get to the level of the capillary, so that every cell that needs oxygen and blood flow can be supplied with that, right? So what you really see is processes in nature that mediate central structures, and then increasingly fine-grained levels of resolution that have increasingly high capacity to bind to very high-resolution parts of the environment, right? And there's a process that mediates between those, and that's what gives rise to the need for that process, and the fact that that process, that Platonic process, is so highly adaptive, that wherever it begins to take root, or wherever it's applied, or wherever it evolves, it actually, whatever begins to use that process or align itself with that process grows. And so what would that look like in a civilization, right? Okay, well, in a civilization was centralizing initially. You see this, you see increased density in the same way that we have our cities. There's a much higher population density in the cities. And then when you have higher density, what happens? Well, you actually see vertical three-dimensional space beginning to be used, because it's more expensive to do so, but it also simultaneously gives you the capacity to keep increasing that density of the central attractor, but you also get secondary benefits. So imagine if you were a king or a ruler of this space, right? Initially, the sort of central brain of this early emergent civilization. Well, it also comes along with the added benefits of oversight, literal oversight, right? You can see further around the actual structure. So you get this self-reinforcing pattern of building a structure in the middle of the domain of this active process of differentiated evolution, interacting with reality at different levels of specialization or different level of resolution. And then early on, well, how do we build these? Well, we built them in the only way that we can, in the same way that ants build, pyramidal structures as well. We started with a wide foundation, and it rose into a pyramidal structure. And that stuck with us in terms of our archetypal imagery and our symbolism. And it, not because we imposed that on nature, but because the structures and the processes to which we conformed gave rise to the physical realities that were then encoded as our cultural symbols, passed down forever. And now we think of hierarchy as pyramid, when that's not actually, like, the reality of the structure is that there's a particular kind of evolutionary process that gives rise to things that do produce pyramids under certain constraints, right? So I know that was quite a long rant there about hierarchies.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I just bring it back to the need for coherence among worldviews and social media networks, because if we are not living within the same, I think one of the benefits that we had as societies, let's say in the 20th century, was that there was centralized information sources, right? Which meant that people occupied the same worlds more so than they do now. Now, the problem with, for one, internet censorship, but two, the ability for people to self-select and create their own echo chambers in their own information environments, means that the worlds which we occupy are becoming increasingly different, and which may lead to combat, which may lead to a coming battle or conflict, because these two worldviews are so at odds with one another. So I guess my question is, how do we balance the benefits that come from a plurality of viewpoints with the need for coherence at the global level, or at the the species level, or however we wish to put it, because it's becoming increasingly obvious that we do need to have this viewpoint of us operating as a species, as like this unitary, this single organism on spaceship Earth, for lack of a better term. So the question is, like, how do we change these, or how do we create new social networks, or technological or technologies that can facilitate this, while not infringing upon, like, if this is to happen, there will be an infringement on people's individual freedom, right? Because we're saying, like, no, you need to have the part of your internal model of the world needs to be coherent with everyone else's. We need to limit, we need to impose constraints in some way. And I don't mean this in some totalitarian sense, but like, we need to have some constraints upon people's information environments to ensure the global or net positive freedom.
I mean, I completely agree. I think it's hard to convince. I think we have a because we are the individuals in the system, we tend to defend the position of the individual or we often tend to defend the individual position and right to sort of explore the information landscape unconstrained. But then, as you're pointing out, there's this interesting question as to what happens when everybody is doing that, and what happens when we don't. Is it possible that actually unfettered access to information and communication tools generates a far less ideal and adaptive outcome than self-imposed constraints on those same impulses that we have, right? The impulse to more information is, I would say, in some ways, evolutionarily analogous to the impulse for more or sugar or fat, right? Something that was actually quite rare evolutionarily, that we have a tendency towards a supernormal stimuli response in terms of our adaptation. And right now we think and we often believe that consuming more information, regardless of the quality of that information or the way that that information is structured, is generally a positive. And I think that acknowledging that that's not true is a first step to beginning to solve this problem in a way, or not solve it, but beginning to adapt to the side effects of our new technologically infused modes of communication, and then realize that actually what makes more sense and what is far more adaptive is spending a lot more time trying to refine information, create connections between patterns of information, but not just the information, the technology, also the sort of ethics and the morality of it. This is the Nietzschean task of making our own morality, right? But not necessarily in the exact way that he supposed, which was sort of this imposition of the human morality upon whatever the sort of next version of ourselves would become. As much as it's this question going back to the sort of emergent gardener or emergent captain idea of, is it possible to codify or create artifacts of our knowledge in our culture that are artistic representations, pieces of literature, pieces of videos or conversations that, or even sayings or phrases that are capable of, as they make their way through the collective psyche of humanity, they are the kind of thing that enable greater conversation, enable greater connection, enable shared values across the other boundaries that are simultaneously emerging in competition, right? So there are ways in which we can communicate, and there are ways in which we can put information into the world that will catalyze and foster a lot more dissonant behavior, a lot more chaotic behavior, a lot more heat, for lack of a better term. And if we are incentivized by networks who profit off of that heat, then the heat is what we're going to get. And then we will destroy ourselves in that conflagration, because that's what happens with heat if it's unbounded. But then simultaneously, you have this other possibility, which is can we train ourselves? Can we come together in ways that can insulate from these unbounded sources of entropy and create seeds of new order, seeds of the kind of ideas, the kind of representations, the kind of projects that are those sort of seed crystals of we have a super saturated solution that we're in. Now, the question is, like, what are the kind of things that seed the next structures that sort of lead the paradigm, that guide the rest of the way that we are going to develop for the next 10, 50, 100 years. Like, it's hard to imagine looking back, if we survive 1,000 years, not looking back on the advent of the internet as this massive inflection point. And we are therefore
the beginning,
still very much in the thick of it, trying to figure out how the human mind should interact with itself and with other human minds in a world where our evolution has occurred largely embedded in space and time, and we've layered on top of that a completely unbounded, mostly unbounded structure that allows us speed of light communication as an emergent organism. And much like many of these other problems, we have not yet demonstrated sufficient wisdom to navigate that. But I do think a huge part of it is to decouple ourselves from a lot of the low resolution, high rate of transmission networks, like things like Twitter. Use them for what they're good for, but try to switch into modes of more embodied communication, having more conversations like this. But most of all, and most importantly, figuring out how to transmute the vision of the world into really concrete actions, and also understand that the real change is actually going to take a much longer time than we would like to believe generally.
Yeah, or that perhaps we need. Like the necessity is also
yes.
a driving factor. And I think that's like my biggest concern. That I think it's definitely possible for us to do it, but the time frame is my biggest concern. I mean, there's, the potential collapse of the biosphere, there's like supposedly 50% of species on Earth could be extinct by the end of the century. 40% of insect species are likely to be extinct or are threatened with extinction at the moment. And like the second and third order effects of that could just spell disaster. So I just think while we have the potential to bring these changes about, the question of whether or not we can do so in the time required is a problem. And as we've seen with the coronavirus, we aren't good at dealing with exponentials, thinking about things in exponential terms. But that's what we're faced with at the moment. Where our time is in many ways characterized by exponential change,
or even in complex terms, right? I mean, I think there's the first level of assessing something like a global virus, which is understanding the way in which our current modes of interconnectivity impact how we respond, or how it spreads through us at the physical level. But then beyond that, there's also these interesting questions of how our new modes of connectivity impact the way that we process the information, the way that we make our decisions at individual and collective levels, and how we do that in a way that is, as adaptive as is possible, right? As flexible as possible, while also as effective and ordered as is necessary. And it's an interesting question because I think, it's deeply related to these other questions of how do we begin to do a better job of emergent sense making. But the fundamental constraints seem to be there are two paths that humanity seems to take. Well, three if you include actual collapse. But when you do see large paradigmatic change, you tend to see it either as a response to almost collapse, right? Near collapse. We have a deep, acute sense of suffering. We make changes in direct response to that. And then the next paradigm grows out of those changes. Or conversely, some small series of inventions or discoveries or accumulated changes snaps together in a way that dramatically changes or enables other technologies, right? And then that grows and sort of inflates and displaces the old things, right? And everybody hops into the new because it's actually attractive. So there's this interesting question, because when it comes to things like all the collective action problems that we're grappling with, I am very skeptical that, so like the first mode, like we won't consider collapse right now because, there's not a whole lot to say about that. But if you look at the mode of, okay, we require a certain amount of suffering, a certain amount of visceral understanding of the problem before we react to it, it's a very precarious place because of the fact that it might be the case that the same thing that's going to cause the suffering is too much for us to handle. And therefore, it's a very risky strategy to rely on things getting bad before we handle the problem. So then it kind of leaves this other trajectory, which, whether it's frustrating or not, and it is frustrating at times, it only really leaves us with this idea of like, well, you have to create something, you have to create a template or a mode of being that is both more capable of what we have at the moment, more capable of surviving, more capable of adapting, more capable of being resilient, more capable of playing nicely with the other ecological systems in which we're embedded, and is more attractive to everyone, right?
I think that's called.
And then, I think really that's the only
in the interest.
Yeah. And that's the only game in town, is like, how do you seed a solution that looks like that? And the hard thing is now it's a race, right? Because like that takes a longer time. But it's kind of a combination of both things. Because if you have a game B-ish, I have my own issues with that specific framing of it, but I do like the fact that people are thinking about it in those terms. If you have people who are increasingly rallying around this idea of developing new patterns of social evolution or adaptation that are far more potentially capable, if you have the life, like if you're simultaneously building boats smaller boats next to the large boat, let's say that we're in the Titanic. If people were building a bunch of little escape boats by the Titanic as it sailed through the ocean, like when it realized that like it was going to run into the iceberg, a lot more people would have survived, and people would have very quickly been like, okay, fuck this boat, I'm gonna get on the other boat, right? So it's like, but if you don't have if you're not building those other boats, so to speak, as the main boat is chugging along, perhaps towards an iceberg, people are going to cling to that main boat, and they're going to do irrational things. Like they're going to believe that boat is unsinkable until it actually sinks, even after it like hits the iceberg, right? Yeah. So that's why I do think the highest leverage games that we can play as people who think about this and care about this are to try in our own world, in our own lives, to channel that energy into actions that provide those alternative boats, which takes the form of living a life that is in line with that, creating communities that are in line with those ideas, and then depicting them in a way that makes them visible and accessible to people who might not otherwise be inclined to hopping out of that game A boat.
Making them replicable. So you can like take what they're doing and then replicate it and mutate, change it in some way. Yeah. It harkens back to
experimenting like simultaneously is the same problem, right? Like you want those different let's just call it game B for the time being. Yeah. You want the different species of game B experiments to simultaneously, again, we have the same tension, be free enough to experiment, but also to be able to have a collective agency that can rival the net scale of the singular structure in which it's in which it is in competition with, right? Yeah. And mutual. I mean, there's a competition aspect, but there's also a mutualism aspect to it. There's a co-opetition, whatever language you
information sharing and all of that. Like that seems to be I think it is the optimal strategy, at least from an evolutionary perspective, because like this is the evolutionary algorithm, for lack of a better term. It's been like the most effective thing, right? Yeah. And I
hate to like be that person who's like, oh, well, it all comes back to this pattern. But it's like it is a very deep pattern. And, in some ways it's hard to imagine given our limited information, given the fact that we can't see the future, given the fact that we don't know what's going to work or even what we will become capable of in the near future, it seems to be the only game in town in some ways. And given that that's the case, it also seems to be the fact that, there's simultaneously the problem. So then what are the real practical problems? Well, the practical problems are like, how do you contribute to the different exploratory tendrils? How do you allow for information transfer of useful patterns between those? And how do you keep those from hitting the Minesweeper problem? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
so those are like
all grand challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
The Minesweeper problem.
That's right? All we have to do.
Yeah. Easy. Yeah. Well, yeah. Matt, I think we'll wrap up shortly. I think there's volumes of books and textbooks behind you. But if you were to share some that really help capture your thinking, or that have really been hugely beneficial for you, and which ones would you recommend? Like, which ones have really contributed to the way you see the world?
Oh, man.
Or individual thinkers.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far we go back. But, I think Hofstadter is someone who shaped my thinking quite early. So, the author of Gödel, Escher, Bach, in terms of understanding. Also, his more recent book, Surfaces and Essences, is a really interesting look into how the cognitive science of analogy and relational information and meaning. But also Stuart Kauffman, I think, is a really underrated thinker, not as well known. His initial work, which is a kind of a tome called The Origins of Order, is a really amazing book. If you can make it through it, it's a very technical book,
very large,
very dense book. But it's also, it pays off in spades in terms of understanding these kind of deep evolutionary patterns and the way in which the image that most people have in their mind of evolution adaptation is often a few ways. One of which is that it's the process that gives rise to its own structure. And there's a whole other way of looking at it that says that there are certain patterns and or forms and or processes that one might call sort of Platonic that also lend order. It's sort of the scaffolding upon which, like the universal or ontological scaffolding upon which evolutionary processes play out. I think that's a really unique contribution that Kauffman has made to the world that I don't think anywhere near enough people understand that it or have sufficiently internalized.
I think it's represented in ways like the tree of life, because it's like upwards, it's bounded, you can't explore the entire space. In order to achieve new heights, you need to constrain the pathway or the avenues of growth. And I think a lot of complexity thinking is kind of embodied in this tree of life. From when I say complexity thinking, I mean including things of like just issues of freedom and constraints and information and energy flows. And it's such a powerful. It's just funny how nature's the best teacher, right?
Well, I mean, this is the interesting aspect about trying to look at the world through this lens of, perhaps there are certain sort of, in the same way that the Platonists looked at the geometry of particular rigid body forms and identified this class of structures that, in their interrelation and in their exploration was so rich in terms of giving rise to many other ways of manipulating and seeing the world around us. I think we're in a similar position now where we really need to begin understanding what those kind of shapes or processes look like at the systems level, and almost a sort of Platonic systems of geometry, if you will. Right. So I mean, like tree-like structures would be one of the components in that grammar. I mean, I think if you just to name one other one, like if you look at the pattern of the cell, right, where you have bounded complexity where one aspect is responsible for mediating internal and external flows, and another aspect is responsible for regenerative, reproductive, and other kinds of internal complexity and managing those structures. Like, I think you can actually take that pattern and apply it far beyond just, the sort of eukaryotic cell.
It's like the problem of decentralization and centralization, right? Like if you decentralize or distribute computation, because that's effectively what cells are, right? Information processing. You apply this to companies, you apply this to city-states, or not city-states, but like nation states. Like you can apply this everywhere, and it's it's the science behind it. It's a science of companies. It's a science of countries in a way. Or that's what we can come up with. I think, a shared favorite book of ours from our last meeting was The Origins of Wealth. And that was one of the big takeaways I got from that book. We won't talk about it here, but
that was what, Beinhocker, right?
Yeah.
Which is I mean, I think he was one of the earliest, he was one of the first people to really codify a lot of the insights in terms of the agent-based representations of evolutionary theories and adaptive landscapes, and really do a great job at applying them to the sort of evolution of our economic interactions.
Yeah.
I mean, I recommend that to people all the time as well. It's hard for me. Like I get that question a lot, and it's like asking, what's your favorite, who's your favorite child or something like that. Like I have such a hard time. Like I'm surrounded by books. I'm always reading books and studying things, as well as attempting to apply their insights. So it's really hard for me to pick favorites, or it always depends on what someone's interested in, and what they're looking to learn about. Yeah.
So if people want to keep up to date with you and your work, if they want to support your work, how can they find you online? Where would you like to direct people towards?
Yeah, I mean, Twitter is fine for now. I mean, I think it's I'm putting a lot of my effort these days into building this tool and these systems. I think if people are interested I'm increasingly going to be looking for people to test these out. So we're starting to let people into the system, starting to let people use it in small numbers. If you would like to do that, if anyone else would be interested in that, just you can email me at matthew@futurealigned.com. So
awesome.
Sounds
great.
That would be something. We haven't put a normal website up for it yet, because we've been intentionally trying to keep things low key, but we're trying to grow it organically with people who actually are going to use it and give good feedback, and who really care about taking that values aligned approach to their behavior. And we want to make it, because I wanted to make it for myself as something that I felt really helped me fulfill my own potential, really to the greatest possible degree along the most dimensions of my life. Not just academically or abstractly, but also in my relationships and human connection and personal development and growth in that sense. So anyone who's interested in that, feel free to email me. Otherwise, probably just follow me on social media at Matt Pirkowski on Twitter. I'll at some point be writing again on Medium. I have a lot of writing, my past writing there. I haven't been writing as much because I've been writing way more code lately than words to communicate ideas with humans. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, all those links I'll share. And Matthew, thank you very much for the time. It's been a great conversation.
It's always a pleasure, Sam.